Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to welcome you to the Mr. Brain channel. Please sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. But before that, please consider giving us a like. I would truly appreciate it, and let me know from where you are watching my videos. Lake of the Woods had always been a sanctuary for me. A sprawling maze of ice-covered water spanning the border between Minnesota and Ontario. I'd fished here every winter for more than 35 years, sometimes with my wife, but mostly alone. She'd preferred summers at the cabin near Baja. When cancer took her last July, everything changed. This winter, more than ever, I needed the solitude. I needed to disappear for a while, to lose myself in the stillness of ice fishing and silence. I loaded my sled and snowmobile at first light, packing carefully. Ice auger, propane heater, cot, lantern, canned food, water, and extra fuel. As I drove deeper onto the frozen expanse toward the isolated chain of islets known as Devil's Elbow, the morning sun cast a pale glow over the ice, turning the world silver and ghostly. It was miles from the resorts and the crowds, perfect isolation, just as I'd planned. The ride was familiar. I knew every bend, every cluster of pines, and every patch of rough ice. I stopped near the southern tip of the largest island, checking ice thickness with practiced caution. 18 inches, more than enough. Within minutes, I drilled a hole and had the shack set up around it, the wind breaking against the heavy canvas walls as I lit my heater and settled in. For the first time in months, I felt truly alone, but it was a comforting loneliness. The first night passed quietly. Dinner from a warmed can, coffee brewed in a dented kettle, a dog-eared paperback to occupy my mind, and sleep on the narrow cot. Dreams came easy, something rare these days, and I woke at sunrise feeling better than I had in months. After breakfast, I ventured north on the snowmobile to visit an old shack belonging to a friend, Jim Barrett, who'd long since moved south for better winters. I hadn't expected anyone would be around, and sure enough, the shack was deserted, everything neatly locked up. On impulse, I drilled a quick test hole nearby and was rewarded immediately with 2 good-sized walleye. Satisfied, I marked the spot mentally, planning to return. By late afternoon, clouds had gathered, dimming the sun to a thin yellow smudge on the horizon. The temperature dropped sharply, sending bitter gusts across the open ice. I hurried back to my shack, the hum of the snowmobile engine fading into a deafening silence as I parked it close to the canvas walls. Inside, I cooked dinner and readied myself for another long, quiet evening. Sleep took hold quickly again. But sometime late in the night, I jerked awake. A noise had disturbed me. I sat up on my cot, listening intently, breathing shallowly. It came again, a slow, measured crunch, footsteps approaching steadily over the ice. I froze, heart hammering. My lantern had gone out, and the shack was dark except for moonlight filtering weakly through frosted canvas. The crunching continued, methodical and unhurried, circling the shack. I gripped the edge of the cot, listening for any sign of human presence, a voice breathing, anything, but there was none, only footsteps. Heavy. Carefully, I eased toward the small window slit and peered through a gap in the frost. The ice outside was empty. Moonlight washed the surface white, but no silhouette broke the desolation. Still, the footsteps continued around me, slowly circling, sometimes stopping abruptly, then starting again, each step hollow and impossibly heavy. I held still, not daring to breathe deeply, every muscle rigid. After what felt like hours but might have only been minutes, the footsteps moved away, fading into silence. I didn't sleep again. I waited, listening until dawn. When the sky finally paled, I found the courage to unzip the shack and step cautiously outside. Cold air bit at my face. The ice spread pristine and empty in every direction. But as I circled around my shack, my stomach tightened. Clear footprints, large and bare, had pressed deeply into the snow and ice, looping in an even circle around the shack. What chilled me to the bone wasn't the size or shape of the prints, though they were disturbingly large and elongated. It was that they started suddenly midway across the ice with no trail leading up to them, and ended just as abruptly a few yards away. Whatever had visited me hadn't walked in or walked away. It had simply appeared and vanished, leaving nothing but footprints and silence. Morning broke heavy and gray, shrouding the lake in thick, drifting fog that seemed to swallow the distant islands entirely. I stood for a long while in front of the shack, staring at those unnatural footprints in disbelief. There was no logical explanation, nothing in all my years of fishing and hunting this land that could make sense of it. I shook off the thoughts and tried to steady myself by returning to routine. I reached for the radio, calling out on the local channel. "Anybody copy? It's Tom Braddock out near Devil's Elbow, thinking of heading in early. Anyone around?" Only static replied. That wasn't unusual this far out, but today it felt oppressive. My cell phone was useless. No bars of reception to anchor me to civilization. I was completely alone, and for the first time in decades, that truth unsettled me. I ate a small breakfast of cold jerky and stale crackers, glancing out at the icy surface of the lake, now blanketed by a fresh dusting of snow. Memories from the night lingered in the forefront of my mind, too real to dismiss. Determined to distract myself, I climbed onto my snowmobile and decided to return to Jim Barrett's old shack. Perhaps there'd be something there, some overlooked clue, something familiar to help settle the twisting unease in my gut. The ride was short but tense, my eyes constantly darting toward the islands and the tree line, expecting movement that never came. I arrived quickly, but as soon as the shack came into view, dread rose sharply inside me. Something had changed. I parked and stepped off the snowmobile slowly, cautious. The front wall of Jim's shack was ripped outward. The thick plywood splintered as though it had exploded from within. My pulse quickened. I approached slowly, boots crunching quietly through fresh snow, my breath fogging in the bitter air. Inside was chaos. The cot Jim had left folded neatly in the corner was shattered. Canvas shredded into ragged ribbons. Blood dark and frozen stained the floorboards and pooled in the corner, spreading outward toward the door. Despite the violence evident everywhere, none of the gear had been disturbed. Jim's tackle box sat untouched, and his propane heater and lantern were neatly stacked as if nothing had happened. There was no body, no trail, just blood. Too much blood for a man to have left behind and still walk away. I backed out quickly, feeling dizzy. The forested islands now seemed to press closer, dark shapes looming silently at the edge of my vision. Panic tightened my throat as I mounted the snowmobile and drove back toward my shack, forcing myself not to glance back at the devastation I'd found. Thoughts raced frantically. Animal attack? Perhaps a bear waking early from hibernation? Or maybe someone dangerous who had hidden out there. But none of these explanations could silence the fear rising sharply inside me. Back at my own shack, I hurried to pack my gear, shoving items quickly and haphazardly into the sled. But as I worked, a sinking realization crept over me. The sun was already dipping toward the horizon, shadows stretching long across the ice. If I tried leaving now, the slush patches forming under the snowpack could trap me miles from shore, leaving me helplessly stranded in the darkness. After a desperate internal debate, I decided my safest move was to wait until first light. Night fell quickly, darker than I remembered ever seeing it. I sat silently on my cot, flare gun clutched tightly, staring at the canvas walls as wind whispered around the shack. It wasn't long after darkness settled completely that I heard the sound, a hollow, mournful howl that seemed to carry impossibly far across the frozen lake. It wasn't the howl of a wolf or the call of any animal I'd heard in my long life. The sound seeped through the shack walls, reverberating through my bones, primal and wrong. My hands shook as I rose carefully and peeked through the narrow window slit toward the nearest island, scarcely visible in the dim starlight. A dark shape stood just within the tree line, tall, gaunt, and unnaturally still. It stood straight and motionless, staring directly across the ice toward my shack. I strained my eyes, searching for details, but darkness swallowed them. The figure remained perfectly motionless, waiting, watching. I lowered myself slowly onto the cot, barely breathing, muscles rigid with fear. Seconds turned into minutes, each stretching painfully, tension building like pressure beneath thin ice. Suddenly, footsteps approached again, crunching slowly toward me. I clenched the flare gun tighter, finger trembling against the trigger. Then came the soft tap, one single knock against the canvas wall behind me, clear and unmistakable. My chest tightened, heart racing wildly. Silence followed, thick, absolute smothering. I waited motionless for another sound, but nothing followed. The shack became unbearably still. The only sound, my ragged breath. Sleep eventually claimed me, though I fought it desperately, terrified by what lay just beyond the thin walls that separated me from whatever lurked in the frozen darkness. And as I drifted off, I knew beyond doubt that it would return before morning. I jerked awake at first light, startled by the sharp cold biting my skin. My breath clouded heavily inside the shack, and a thin layer of frost had formed along the walls overnight. Everything felt dangerously still, as though the lake itself had frozen solid in its sleep. The memory of last night's tapping resurfaced quickly, making my pulse quicken. I forced myself upright, aching and stiff from tension, and began hastily gathering my belongings. Ignoring organization, I threw my gear into the sled cot, heater, supplies, all jammed together. I was past caring about broken equipment. Panic was taking hold, compelling me toward only one goal: escape. My hand shook as I secured the last tie-down and glanced nervously across the ice toward the tree line. No movement disturbed the silent pines, but the feeling of being watched never left. As I climbed onto the snowmobile, the motor fired to life instantly, its growl breaking the heavy silence. I glanced behind me once more, expecting to see the dark figure emerging from the trees, but saw nothing. Gritting my teeth, I opened the throttle wide, accelerating quickly across the open ice toward the ranger outpost 12 miles away. For a few minutes, I let relief creep into my thoughts, feeling my muscles loosen. I was getting away. It was going to be all right. But then something in the side mirror caught my eye, snapping me back into full alertness. A shape moved behind me, dark against the white expanse of ice, impossibly fast. My chest tightened, and my breath came sharply. I risked a quick look over my shoulder. What I saw sent raw panic surging through me. A gaunt figure pursued me relentlessly, running upright in an unnatural jerking motion. It moved too fast, bounding forward in massive strides, long arms swinging low beside its emaciated body. Its skin was pale and leathery, almost gray, stretched tightly over prominent ribs and sharp joints. Even from this distance, its eyes burned bright and hollow. Desperation gripped me, and I pressed the throttle harder. My snowmobile surged forward, engine whining in protest. The figure behind let out a strange guttural cry, a sound somewhere between choking and rage. The ice ahead looked fragile now, riddled with pockets of slush and dark water seeping through cracks. I knew I was pushing the limit, but slowing down wasn't an option. Glancing back again, the creature had closed the gap terrifyingly fast. In a frantic bid to buy myself time, I grabbed the flare gun from my coat pocket, aimed shakily upward and fired. The flare rocketed into the gray sky, exploding in a bright burst that momentarily distracted the pursuing figure. It paused briefly, shielding its face from the sudden blaze, and I gained precious distance. Just as I felt a glimmer of hope, the snowmobile lurched violently, skis plunging into a slush pocket hidden beneath fresh snow. The machine stopped abruptly, pitching me forward. Ice cracked loudly beneath me, water rushing into the newly opened hole, pulling the snowmobile under with alarming speed. I scrambled desperately, icy water flooding around my knees and soaking through my clothes instantly. The shoreline stood less than 30 yards ahead. Crawling forward, fingers digging painfully into the frozen slush, I dragged myself from the widening hole, ice splintering loudly beneath my weight. Behind me, footsteps thudded steadily closer. The growling, choking sound of the creature echoed closer, closing rapidly. I refused to turn, knowing that seeing it clearly would rob me of any strength left. Reaching the shoreline felt surreal. I collapsed heavily onto solid snow just as the ice behind me shattered, splashing violently as something crashed through, shrieking furiously. Unable to move, I lay gasping in the snow, trembling uncontrollably, certain I was moments from being dragged back. But the attack never came. Instead, a different sound reached me, an approaching vehicle. A game warden's ATV appeared on the nearby service trail, drawn by the flare. He jumped out, eyes wide in shock, helping me onto the back of his vehicle. He wrapped an emergency blanket around me, asking questions I could barely answer. 2 days later, after warming up and recovering at the ranger station, I returned to the spot with the local authorities. The ice had refrozen overnight, erasing all evidence of my near drowning, except for long claw marks etched deeply into the fresh ice, tracing away from the hole. No blood, no animal tracks, no obvious explanation for what had pursued me, just those marks, impossibly deep and spaced too far apart for any animal I knew. I never returned to Lake of the Woods. I sold everything, the shack, the gear, the snowmobile. Yet as much as I've tried to forget, the memory refuses to fade. I told my story once to the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources. They recorded it, but the tape quickly vanished. Officially, the incident was labeled an animal attack and dismissed. Yet every winter I hear stories whispered by the locals of fishermen going missing out near Devil's Elbow, leaving only abandoned gear, blood-stained ice, and deep, impossible footprints leading nowhere. I never minded the quiet. Not when I was overseas, and certainly not now that I was running snowplows for Arizona Department of Transportation along Arizona's White Mountains. Some of the guys complained about the night shifts, said the isolation got to them. But after 4 tours in Afghanistan with an engineering unit clearing IEDs from lonely mountain roads, this felt peaceful. Until tonight, anyway. It was mid-April, technically spring, but this late snowstorm had blown in like a slap across the face, burying Route 273 beneath 2 feet of thick, wet powder. Dispatch had called me in after dinner. A 4-hour job at most, they'd said. Simple enough. Clear the route, get home by sunrise. But the storm was heavier than forecasted. Visibility dropping and the temperature already down into the teens. It felt colder every minute, even inside the cab. The wipers clicked steadily as I eased the plow along the dark highway, snowbanks building on either side. Tall stands of spruce and fir crowded the road, thick branches bowed low beneath snow that kept falling. The cab heater fought hard against the cold outside, but I could still feel the chill seeping through the windows, ice forming on the edges of the glass. My headlights barely pierced the swirling white, shadows flickering through my peripheral vision each time the beam swept across the trees. I was near Crescent Lake when I saw the car. A silver Subaru Forester, nose crunched into a drift on the side of the road. Hazards flashed dimly, nearly hidden beneath a mound of fresh snow. I slowed the plow and rolled to a stop behind the vehicle, the engine idling low. It wasn't uncommon for people to underestimate these storms and end up stranded, especially this close to the reservation boundary. "Dispatch, this is Kyle Moreno," I said into the radio mic. "Got an abandoned vehicle near mile marker 47.5, Route 273. Looks stuck good. Going to check it out." Static buzzed back at me, faint voices lost somewhere in between. Reception had been spotty all night. I logged the vehicle's location into my notebook, zipped up my jacket and stepped outside. The wind hit like frozen nails, bitter and stinging, numbing my cheeks instantly. I trudged over to the Subaru through knee-deep drifts, flashlight slicing through the darkness. The driver's side door hung wide open, snow blowing in sideways, already starting to pile up on the empty seat. The keys still dangled from the ignition, chiming softly with each gust of wind. I leaned inside, scanning quickly. A wallet sat untouched in the cup holder, flipped open to a tribal ID. Desiree N., White River 26. The photograph showed a young woman smiling shyly, dark eyes looking out with quiet warmth. I glanced up and felt my chest tighten. A large smear of blood stained the fabric seat, dark and already partially frozen, trailing out onto the snow outside. Swallowing hard, I stepped back and swept the flashlight beam around the Subaru, looking for signs of struggle or a crash victim. That's when I saw the tracks. Bare footprints, not boots or shoes. Bare feet pressed deeply into the snow. The toes splayed wide, unevenly spaced, as if limping or stumbling. The tracks led straight from the driver's side door, away from the road and into the dense woods below the embankment. I stood frozen for a moment, listening to the crack of branches shifting under the heavy snow in the distance. My training told me to follow, to look for someone who might be hypothermic or injured, but my gut twisted in apprehension. Something felt wrong. It wasn't just the absence of shoes or the bitter cold that nagged at me. It was the unnatural spacing of those footprints, stretched and uneven, like whoever made them wasn't walking normally, wasn't even walking comfortably. "Dispatch," I called again into the radio, urgency edging into my voice. "Possible injured motorist. Footprints going into the woods. Request immediate assistance." Only static responded, an empty hiss that seemed to mock me from the silent cab. I took a few tentative steps toward the tree line, flashlight beam trembling slightly in the wind. The footprints led downward, plunging straight into darkness, swallowed by dense fir trees, whose branches tangled together like grasping hands. Snow drifted steadily, quickly filling and softening the sharp edges of the prints. I hesitated at the tree line, flashlight trembling slightly in my grip. The darkness was impenetrable, dense and oppressive. Deep shadows moved with the wind. Branches creaked under the weight of snow, and somewhere further in, a single branch snapped sharply, quick and brittle, as if stepped on by something heavy. Every nerve in my body warned me to stop, to step back. It wasn't cowardice. I'd faced worse fear than this in deserts thousands of miles away. But something deeper, older, a feeling more instinct than thought. I retreated slowly, still facing the woods, then hurried back to the plow, slamming the heavy door shut and locking it behind me. Snow swirled angrily against the windows, as if annoyed that I'd escaped back to shelter. "Dispatch, this is Moreno," I said again, throat tight. "Need someone out here ASAP. I've got blood on scene, footprints leading into the woods, injured person suspected." The static wavered briefly, then silence. I set the mic down, heart hammering. I stared through the windshield at the dark wall of trees, snow obscuring everything now, except for the faint irregular depressions marking where Desiree had fled into the night. And as I shifted the plow back into gear and slowly continued forward, I couldn't shake the sensation that something out there in the frozen darkness had watched the whole thing unfold, waiting patiently for me to return. I'd moved on from the abandoned Subaru, but my mind wouldn't let it go. The image of those barefoot tracks kept replaying in my head, the blood on the seat vivid behind my eyes. The radio still wasn't working, nothing but static hissing back at me each time I tried dispatch. It felt as if the snowstorm had cut me off entirely from the rest of the world, trapping me alone along Route 27-3. It was just past midnight, and visibility had fallen to less than 50 feet. Snow piled up relentlessly, thickening into heavy drifts along the edges of the road. The cab was getting colder despite the heater running at full blast, the windows slowly fogging with condensation. Every mile crawled by painfully slow. My headlights cut feebly through the swirling flakes, illuminating only glimpses of empty road ahead, as if the world outside had shrunk down to nothing. The plow's engine suddenly sputtered, jolted, then went silent, taking every electrical system with it. The cab went dark, headlights out, dash lights off, heater silent. I tried the ignition, twisting the key, then pressing the starter repeatedly. Nothing, not even a click. It felt as though someone had simply flipped a switch, killing everything at once. My breath plumed out into visible mist as the warmth drained from the cab. Already feeling the bite of the cold seeping inside, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out cautiously. Wind immediately ripped at my face, snow stinging my eyes. The beam of my flashlight flickered through swirling powder as I circled the front, popped the hood, and checked beneath. Battery terminals secure, belts intact, no leaks. I couldn't find a single visible cause for the sudden shutdown. Frustration gnawed at me, mixing with unease. Something like this should never have happened. Not all at once, not without warning. As I stood staring helplessly at the silent engine compartment, I heard it clearly. A sharp, sudden inhale from somewhere down the slope. Not quite animal. Definitely not human. It was a wet, strangled intake of breath, followed by the distinct sound of a large branch snapping under weight. I turned, flashlight shaking in my hand as I swept the tree line. My beam skittered nervously over snow-covered spruce, searching for movement. Only darkness and snow, thick and endless. But something shifted, a shadow just beyond where my beam reached. Whatever it was tall, upright, moving slowly between the trees, careful and quiet. I hurried back to the cab, locking the doors behind me. My pulse throbbed rapidly in my throat, ears ringing with adrenaline. I tugged open the lockbox beneath the seat, removing my Ruger .357 and gripping it firmly. Comforted by the weight in my hand, I stared out through the windshield, trying to calm myself, watching snow pile up across the glass. Nothing moved, nothing stirred outside. But the silence didn't feel empty. It felt intentional, like something was choosing not to make noise. The forest outside was quiet, frozen, almost waiting. Then the entire plow shifted suddenly, just a small tilt at first, as though something had stepped onto the bumper at the back. My heart pounded louder, breath shallow. I turned slowly, staring through the dark rear window. A scraping sound echoed softly, long, rasping, like something hard and sharp dragging itself along the steel siding of the plow. It moved slowly, deliberately from the back toward the driver's side. Then came the heavy, distinct thump of footsteps in snow. They stopped just beside my window. I gripped the revolver tighter, raising it slowly. My breathing turned ragged, shallow puffs of vapor, rapidly fogging the glass. I stared out at the snow-blurred night, too terrified to move or look away. Slowly, a shape appeared. A tall figure, thin and impossibly gaunt, emerging silently from the swirling snow. My stomach knotted as the flashlight's dim reflection illuminated a ribcage stretched tightly beneath pale, stretched skin. Arms hung unnaturally long, knobby joints protruding through emaciated flesh. Its head, something between an elk skull and bare bone, rose into the beam. Two immense antlers jutted skyward, each tine sharp and twisted like dead branches. My breath caught, a strangled noise in my throat. I sat frozen, fingers clenched around the revolver, my whole body tense with dread. It stopped there, directly outside the window. Dark, empty sockets turned toward the cab. For a long moment, it stood motionless in the swirling storm, almost a statue carved from ice and bone. Then, slowly and deliberately, it raised one elongated skeletal hand and tapped a single finger against the glass. Tap, 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 tap. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The tapping echoed painfully in my ears, the revolver trembling uselessly in my grasp. Every muscle in my body urged me to fire, to scream, to flee. But my instincts held me still. Then, from the trees behind the plow, another sound cracked through the night. A second inhale, deeper, wetter, more guttural. The figure outside the window tilted its head toward the sound, as if listening. It dropped its hand, turned silently, and stepped away, disappearing into the snowstorm. I stayed rigid, frozen in the seat, watching the snow pile up against the windshield until my limbs began to cramp. Hours passed, or minutes, I couldn't tell. Nothing returned to the plow. I could only sit there in agonizing silence, trapped in darkness, knowing that whatever had been outside, whatever was still out there, hadn't left me. It had merely stepped back, waiting somewhere out of sight. The hours crawled by. My watch read 4:19 a.m., but it felt like time itself had stopped. Every muscle in my body ached from the tension of remaining perfectly still, cramped into the freezing cab. My breath frosted heavily on the inside of the windshield, blocking most of my view outside. The cold seeped into my bones despite layers of clothing, biting deep into my skin. But I barely noticed. I couldn't stop replaying that skeletal shape, the tapping finger on the glass. Couldn't silence the memory of that thing's empty, hollow stare. I shifted slightly, just enough to ease the ache in my legs. My hand still gripped the revolver, my knuckles stiff and white. I hadn't moved from the driver's seat in hours, hadn't dared look away from the window. Outside, snow continued piling up in thick, oppressive layers, further isolating me. I strained my ears for any noise, any movement in the frozen silence. Nothing, just my own shallow breaths, filling the cab with vapor and the faint groaning of metal as the plow settled beneath the weight of the snow. But then a quiet click, almost lost beneath my breathing. I twisted my head toward the passenger door. The handle jiggled softly. Once, twice, as if being tested from outside. I lifted the revolver, aiming shakily toward the door. My heart pounded violently, blood roaring in my ears. But the movement stopped. No entry, no attempt to force the handle further. Just a sudden empty silence, as if the intruder had decided against it. I couldn't move, could barely breathe. Every nerve in my body burned with adrenaline, pulse hammering rapidly through my veins. Minutes passed, then an hour, maybe two. I didn't lower the revolver, didn't relax. My exhaustion blurred into numbness, eyes heavy but unblinking, fixed on the shadowy windows. Eventually, dawn began to break. Thin shafts of pale gray sunlight filtered through gaps in the ice-crusted windshield. Slowly, stiffly, I leaned forward, squinting into the murky half-light. Snowdrifts nearly buried the plow, and everything outside was blanketed white and silent. The dark tree line was still, empty. No movement, no skeletal figures, nothing but endless snow. Taking a long, ragged breath, I forced myself upright and unlocked the driver's door, pushing it open with trembling hands. Cold air bit into my face, snapping me awake. Alert, I stepped unsteadily out into knee-deep snow, stumbling slightly as my numb legs tried to regain their feeling. I circled cautiously around the plow, pistol still raised, ready. What I saw stopped me in my tracks, breath hitching painfully in my throat. The side mirrors were shattered, metal twisted and bent outward, jagged edges glinting in the weak morning sun. The passenger door hung askew, violently wrenched away from its hinges, as though something unimaginably strong had tried to pull it loose. Deep, irregular scratches gouged the metal siding, forming patterns that looked like long claw marks dragged through the paint. And around the entire vehicle, circling endlessly, relentlessly, were the same barefoot prints I'd seen back at the abandoned Subaru. But these were different now. Wider, deeper, impossibly large and elongated. They didn't walk away. They only circled, again and again, overlapping in places as though whatever made them had paced endlessly, patiently, around the plow all night. I backed away, stumbling out onto the road. Revolver still gripped tight in my hand. Panic swelled in my chest. Without thinking clearly, I turned and staggered down the road, away from the plow, away from the circling footprints, away from whatever had waited all night just outside my window. 2 miles I walked, legs heavy, clothes frozen stiff. I didn't feel the cold anymore, only the deep, penetrating numbness. Finally, headlights appeared through the swirling snow, cutting toward me. Another 8OT plow. I collapsed to my knees on the icy pavement as the other driver jumped out, rushing toward me. He said something I couldn't make it out. His voice sounded distant, distorted, lost in the noise inside my head. His face blurred and swam before me as he reached down, grasping my shoulders, yelling my name. His eyes widened as he looked down at my revolver, still tightly clenched in my trembling hand. "What happened, Kyle?" he shouted, voice cracking. "Where's your truck?" I tried to speak, to explain, but words wouldn't form. Instead, I found myself repeating a single hoarse sentence. "Don't follow those footprints. That's not her out there. Not anymore." Later, I sat shivering beneath blankets in the warmth of a rescue vehicle, watching silently as emergency crews and tribal police combed the snow around my abandoned plow. They found nothing. No sign of the missing woman, no skeletal figures. Just a single bloody footprint on the floor of my cab. Too large, too elongated to belong to any human. Days later, the official report listed exposure, exhaustion, and possible hallucinations due to hypothermia. The missing woman was never found, and I refused to return to Route 27-3 again. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw those footprints circling endlessly around me through the snow, patient and hungry in the darkness. And even now, in the safety of my home miles away, I know with absolute certainty that whatever had stalked me out there on the frozen highway hadn't truly left. It was still waiting somewhere beyond the snow line, biding its time. I never imagined that my 33rd year would bring me face to face with something that would shake my understanding of what lurks in the quiet places of this world. My name doesn't matter now. What matters is what happened during those 48 hours in October, when the Swedish wilderness showed me its true face. Living in Småland, in a town so small it barely registers on most maps, you learn to appreciate the vast stretches of untouched forest that surround you. The silence here isn't just quiet, it's absolute, broken only by the wind through ancient pines and the distant call of loons across hidden lakes. I've always found solace in these wild places, especially after my divorce 2 years ago left me searching for something I couldn't name. The back problems that had plagued me through the summer were finally manageable by mid-October. Months of physiotherapy and careful stretching had given me enough mobility to consider my annual camping trip to Djupsjön, the deep lake, a remote body of water nestled in a chain of connected waterways about 3 hours' hike from the nearest road. The locals in my town speak of it in hushed tones, not because of any superstition, but because of its raw, untamed beauty and the way sound carries across its surface in the dead of night. My friend Astrid agreed to join me, though I could tell she had reservations. She's always been more comfortable with her creature comforts than I am, but she understood my need to reclaim this ritual that had become so important to my mental health. We packed carefully. October camping in Sweden demands respect for the elements. Our gear included heavy sleeping bags rated for sub-zero temperatures, waterproof everything, and enough food for 4 days in case weather trapped us longer than planned. The hike-in took us along increasingly narrow trails, marked only by faded blazes on tree trunks and occasional cairns left by previous hikers. The forest grew denser as we climbed, the canopy blocking out more and more daylight until we were walking through a green-tinted twilight even at midday. The sound of our footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness, our breathing visible in small puffs despite the mild temperature. When we finally emerged at the lake's edge around 4 in the afternoon, I was struck by how different it looked from my memories. The water level seemed lower than usual, exposing more of the rocky shoreline and revealing the skeletal remains of drowned trees that normally stayed hidden beneath the surface. These pale, twisted branches reached up from the depths like gnarled fingers, creating an almost cemetery-like atmosphere around the lake's perimeter. Several other groups had already established camp, more than I'd ever seen here before. A young couple with kayaks had claimed the best spot on the eastern shore, while a family with 2 children, maybe 8 and 10 years old, had set up an elaborate campsite complete with a screened dining fly. Their laughter echoed across the water as they played on the narrow beach, the sound both comforting and somehow unsettling in its intensity. We found a decent spot about 50 meters from the water's edge, close enough to enjoy the view but far enough back to avoid the moisture that would rise from the lake as temperatures dropped overnight. As we set up our tent, I noticed how the other campers kept glancing toward the water nervously, their conversations dropping to whispers whenever the wind died down completely. The process of making camp took on an almost ritualistic quality as the afternoon wore on. Every stake driven into the ground, every guy line adjusted, felt like we were marking our territory in a place that didn't quite welcome human presence. The old wind shelter Astrid and I decided to use for our evening fire sat about 30 meters from our tent. Its corrugated metal roof partially collapsed on one side and graffitied with initials and dates going back decades. Someone had carved "God Protect Us All, 1987" into one of the support beams, the letters deep and precise, as if made with desperate intention rather than casual vandalism. I ran my fingers over the words, feeling the rough edges of the cuts, and wondered what had prompted such an urgent plea in this seemingly peaceful place. The fireplace itself was in better condition than the shelter, built from local stones and blackened by countless previous fires. Someone had left a decent supply of split birch and pine, though the wood felt unusually damp for October. It took several attempts and half a tube of fire-starting paste to get flames going, and even then the fire seemed reluctant to catch properly, producing more smoke than heat in those first crucial minutes. As evening approached, the temperature began dropping more rapidly than I'd expected. My weather app showed clear skies and mild temperatures, but the air felt thick and oppressive, like it does before a severe thunderstorm. The other campers seemed to sense it too. Conversations became more subdued, and I noticed the family with children kept glancing up at the sky as if expecting clouds that weren't there. Dinner was a simple affair of instant pasta and canned sauce, but even the familiar ritual of cooking over an open flame felt different somehow. The flames danced in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, casting shadows that moved independently of their source. Astrid commented on it first, pausing mid-sentence to stare at the fire with a puzzled expression. "Have you ever seen flames move like that?" she asked, pointing to where the fire seemed to be reaching toward the lake, bending at impossible angles despite the complete absence of wind. I had noticed it too, but hearing her voice, my unease made it suddenly more real, more threatening. The fire was behaving like it was being drawn toward something, pulled by an invisible force that had nothing to do with air currents or fuel distribution. When I tried to photograph the phenomenon, my phone camera refused to focus properly, producing only blurred images that showed nothing unusual. The children from the family campsite had grown quieter as darkness fell, staying close to their parents instead of exploring the shoreline as they had earlier. I caught their father scanning the tree line repeatedly, his hand resting on what looked like a large hunting knife on his belt. When our eyes met across the distance between our camps, he offered a tense smile and a nod, but didn't approach for the usual camping small talk about weather and trail conditions. By 9 o'clock, full darkness had settled over the lake like a heavy blanket. The water, which had been mirror-smooth during the day, now moved with small, regular swells that seemed to originate from no particular source. These waves lapped against the shore with a rhythm that was almost hypnotic, but just irregular enough to keep you from getting comfortable with the sound. Astrid and I had retreated to the warmth of our sleeping bags by 10:30, though neither of us felt particularly tired. The kind of exhaustion that comes from fresh air and physical activity seemed absent, replaced by a restless energy that made relaxation impossible. We lay in our respective sleeping bags, making quiet conversation about everything except the growing sense that something was fundamentally wrong with this place. The sounds of the lake at night were unlike anything I remembered from previous visits. Instead of the gentle lapping of small waves, the water moved with purpose, creating sounds that resembled footsteps, deliberate, measured, circling. When I mentioned this to Astrid, she admitted she'd been listening to the same thing for the past hour, trying to convince herself it was just the wind or settling ice, though the temperature hadn't dropped below freezing. Around midnight, Astrid's breathing settled into the deep rhythm of sleep, but rest continued to evade me. My back ached despite the comfortable sleeping pad, and every small sound from outside seemed amplified to an unbearable degree. The zipper on our tent fly rattled with each breath of wind, creating a metallic chattering that sounded almost like Morse code. That's when I first became aware of the watching. It started as a feeling, the familiar sensation of being observed that makes the hair on your neck stand up. But this was more intense than anything I'd experienced before. A presence so focused and deliberate that it felt almost physical, like a weight pressing down on the tent from above. I found myself holding my breath, listening for any sound that might explain the sensation, but the night had gone completely quiet. Even the water had stopped its rhythmic movement against the shore. I reached for my phone to check the time, squinting at the bright screen in the darkness. 2:47 a.m. The battery showed full charge, but the signal bars were completely absent. Not unusual this far into the wilderness. But my phone had shown at least one bar when we'd arrived. Now it displayed no service, with the finality of a door slamming shut. The first sound came from directly above us. It started as a soft scratching against the tent's rainfly, like branches brushing against the fabric in the wind. But the scratching was too regular, too purposeful to be random contact with vegetation. It moved in deliberate patterns across the roof of our tent, pausing at the corners as if testing the structural integrity of our shelter. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing, as the scratching continued its circuit around our tent. 3 times it made the complete loop: roof, down the side, across the bottom edge, up the other side, back to the roof. Each circuit took exactly the same amount of time, as if whatever was making the sound was following a predetermined route with mechanical precision. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the sound had been. At least while I could hear the scratching, I knew where the threat was located. Now, whatever had been testing our defenses could be anywhere. Circling back for another approach, moving to a different position, or simply waiting for us to let our guard down. I reached over carefully to wake Astrid, but she was already awake, her eyes wide and reflecting what little light filtered through the tent walls. She held up a finger to her lips, then pointed toward the tent's entrance. Through the thin fabric, we could see the shadow of something large moving past, blocking out what little starlight made it through the forest canopy. The shadow paused directly in front of our tent. What stood outside our tent defied easy description. Through the translucent fabric, we could see its outline. Roughly human in proportions, but wrong in every detail that mattered. Too tall, too broad at the shoulders, with limbs that seemed to bend at joints that shouldn't exist. It remained motionless for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, as if studying our reactions to its presence. I found myself analyzing every detail I could make out, trying to find rational explanations that refused to come. The shape was definitely bipedal, but its posture was all wrong, leaning forward in a way that suggested a different center of gravity than any human would have. When it moved, it did so with a fluid motion that reminded me of water flowing uphill, natural in its own way but fundamentally disturbing to observe. Astrid had pressed herself against the far side of the tent, as far from the entrance as possible, her sleeping bag pulled up to her chin. I could hear her trying to control her breathing, taking slow, deliberate breaths through her nose to avoid making any sound that might draw the thing's attention. Her face was pale in the dim light, eyes fixed on the shadow that continued its patient vigil just outside our door. The temperature inside the tent began dropping noticeably. Despite our body heat and the insulation of our sleeping bags, our breath became visible, small puffs of vapor that dissipated quickly in the increasingly frigid air. This wasn't the gradual cooling you'd expect from a clear night. It was as if something was actively drawing heat from our immediate environment. I reached for the small knife I kept clipped to the inside of the tent, more for comfort than any realistic hope it would be useful against whatever was out there. The metal was so cold it almost burned my fingers, and I realized that the temperature drop was severe enough to affect our gear. Our water bottles, which had been room temperature when we went to bed, now showed a skin of ice around their contents. The shadow began moving again, but this time its motion was different, more exploratory, almost curious. It reached toward the tent with what might have been an arm, pressing against the fabric from outside. The tent wall bent inward under the pressure, forming an impression that looked almost like a handprint, but with too many fingers, each one too long and jointed in the wrong places. The pressure increased gradually, stretching the fabric to its limits. I could hear the synthetic material beginning to stress, making tiny popping sounds as individual threads reached their breaking point. If this continued, our tent, our only barrier between us and whatever was out there, would tear open, leaving us exposed and defenseless. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the pressure stopped. The shadow withdrew, and we heard footsteps moving away from our campsite, but not the footsteps of any creature I could identify. They were too heavy, landing with the solid impact of something much larger than a human, but spaced too far apart for any animal I knew. Each step seemed to sink deep into the ground, as if the thing walking was far heavier than its size would suggest. We tracked its movement by sound as it circled our camp in a wide arc, staying just at the edge of visibility in the forest. The footsteps had a wet quality to them, like boots squelching through mud, though the ground around our campsite had been relatively dry. Occasionally we heard the sound of branches breaking under its weight, though the forest here wasn't particularly dense. The circuit it made around our position took nearly 10 minutes, a leisurely pace that suggested it wasn't in any hurry to leave. When it completed the circle, returning to approximately where it had started, the footsteps stopped entirely. Once again we were left in complete silence, not knowing where the threat had gone or whether it was still nearby. What happened next challenged everything I thought I knew about the natural world. The silence that had fallen over our campsite was broken by a sound from the lake, not the gentle lapping of waves, but something that resembled human speech, though distorted beyond easy recognition. Voices seemed to rise from the water itself, multiple conversations overlapping in languages that might have been Swedish or might have been something else entirely. The words were just clear enough to be maddening. I found myself straining to understand, catching fragments that sounded like names, like pleas, like warnings given too late to matter. Astrid grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in so hard I knew there would be bruises the next day. She was hearing it too. This impossible conversation between the living water and something that answered from beneath its surface. "Do you understand what they're saying?" she whispered, her voice barely audible even in the complete silence of our tent. I shook my head, though I wasn't entirely truthful. Some of the words were becoming clearer as my ears adjusted to the strange acoustics. I heard "go into närmare," "don't come closer," repeated several times in what sounded like a child's voice. Other phrases were less distinct but carried an unmistakable tone of urgency, of warning. The voices seemed to be coming from different depths in the lake, some sounding like they were just below the surface while others echoed up from much deeper water. This created a layered effect, like a choir singing in rounds, but the harmonies were all wrong, creating dissonances that made my teeth ache and my vision blur around the edges. As we listened, the conversations began to organize themselves into something approaching coherence. It became clear that some voices were asking questions while others provided answers, though the answers were rarely reassuring. The deeper voices, the ones that seemed to come from the very bottom of the lake, spoke with an authority that the surface voices lacked, giving instructions or pronouncements that were received with what sounded like fear or resignation. I realized that I was beginning to understand more of what was being said, as if exposure to the sounds was teaching me their meaning through some process that bypassed normal language acquisition. This understanding brought with it a growing sense of horror as the content of the conversations became clear. They were discussing us. The surface voices, the ones that sounded most human, were reporting on our presence, describing our campsite, our gear, our apparent level of preparation or vulnerability. The deeper voices asked questions about our behavior, our defenses, our likely responses to different approaches. It was like listening to predators plan an attack, comparing notes on the best strategies for dealing with their prey. But there was something else in the conversation that was even more disturbing. References to previous visitors, other campers who had come to this lake over the years. The voices spoke of them with the casual familiarity of creatures discussing a regular food source, comparing the relative merits of different groups, different individuals, different methods of approach. One surface voice, speaking in what I now clearly recognized as Swedish, mentioned the family with children currently camped on the eastern shore. The description was detailed and clinical, noting the parents' vigilance, the children's movements during the day, the layout of their campsite. The deep voice that responded gave what sounded like approval, followed by instructions that I couldn't quite make out but that filled me with a cold dread. The voices were planning something for tonight, and it involved all of us. At 3:47 a.m., Exactly 1 hour after the voices from the lake had fallen silent, we heard the first scream. It came from the direction of the family's campsite. High-pitched and filled with terror, the scream of a child who has seen something that their young mind cannot process or accept. The sound cut through the night air like a blade, sharp and clean and absolutely horrible in its intensity. It was followed immediately by a second scream, different in pitch but equally terrified, as the other child joined the first. Astrid and I were out of our sleeping bags and moving toward the tent entrance before we'd consciously decided to act. Every instinct told us to stay hidden, to avoid drawing attention to ourselves, but the sound of children and mortal terror overrode our self-preservation. I grabbed the large flashlight from my pack while Astrid found her hiking boots, and we prepared to leave the relative safety of our tent. The screaming continued, but it was moving, not staying in one place as you'd expect if the children were in their tent or campsite, but traveling in a path that seemed to lead toward the water. Mixed with the children's voices, we could hear their parents shouting, calling their names, their voices raw with panic and desperation. I unzipped the tent fly and stepped into the night, my flashlight beam cutting through darkness so complete it seemed solid. The beam only extended about 20 meters before being swallowed by the black air, creating a small bubble of visibility that moved with us as we hurried toward the eastern shore. The ground between our campsite and the family's location was rougher than I remembered from the daylight crossing, filled with roots and holes that seemed designed to trip us up. More than once I had to grab Astrid's arm to keep her from falling, and twice she did the same for me as we navigated terrain that seemed to shift and change under our feet. As we got closer to the other campsite, the screaming began to fade. Not because it was ending, but because it was moving away from us, toward the lake. The parents' voices were closer now, and I could make out individual words in their panicked calls. They were Swedish, from Stockholm based on their accent, and they were calling for Maya and Eric, the children whose screams were now coming from somewhere near the water's edge. When we reached their campsite, we found chaos. Their tent had been torn open from the outside, the fabric shredded as if by massive claws. Camping gear was scattered in all directions, and their carefully organized camp kitchen had been completely destroyed. The parents, a woman in her 30s and a man about my age, were standing at the edge of the light from our flashlight, calling desperately into the darkness. "Our children," the woman said when she saw us, switching to accented English. "Something took our children. We heard them screaming, and when we got out of the tent they were gone. The screaming is coming from the lake, but we can't see anything." The man was already moving toward the water, following the sound of voices that were growing fainter with each passing moment. "Maja, Eric, where are you?" he called, his voice cracking with emotion. I aimed my flashlight toward the lake, but the beam seemed weaker here, as if the darkness around the water was particularly resistant to illumination. We could still hear the children, but their voices were different now, less panicked, more confused, as if they were no longer certain of their own situation. That's when we saw the shapes in the water. The lake, which had been mirror smooth when we arrived, was now churning with movement. Dark shapes broke the surface at irregular intervals, too large and too numerous to be fish, too purposeful in their movements to be debris stirred up by wind. In the weak beam of my flashlight, I could make out what looked like heads, or at least rounded protrusions that turned toward our light as if aware of our presence. The children's voices were definitely coming from the water now, but they sounded wrong, too calm, too accepting of their situation. Instead of the panicked screaming we'd heard earlier, Maja and Eric were now speaking in conversational tones, as if they were discussing something mildly interesting, rather than finding themselves somehow transported to the middle of a dark lake in the middle of the night. "They're talking to something," Astrid whispered, her hand gripping my arm so tightly I could feel her fingernails through my jacket. "Listen, they're answering questions." She was right. The children's voices had taken on the rhythm of a dialogue, pausing as if listening to responses we couldn't hear, then answering in the polite, careful tones children use when talking to adult strangers. But there was something else in their voices now, a dreamy quality, as if they were speaking from within a trance or under some form of influence. The parents had heard it too. The father was already wading into the lake, ignoring the shocking cold of the water as he pushed deeper, following the sound of his children's voices. "Maja, Eric, swim to me. Can you hear me?" he called, but his children didn't seem to register his presence at all. The mother grabbed my flashlight, aiming it toward where her husband was now waist-deep in the dark water. In the beam, we could see more of the shapes surrounding him, sleek, dark forms that moved with intelligence and purpose. They weren't approaching him directly, but they were definitely watching him, circling at a distance that seemed calculated to prevent escape while avoiding direct confrontation. "There are so many of them," the mother breathed, her voice filled with a mixture of terror and awe. "What are they? What do they want with our children?" I couldn't answer because I was beginning to understand something that I desperately didn't want to acknowledge. The shapes in the water weren't random creatures that had wandered into the lake. They belonged here. This was their territory, their hunting ground, and we were all intruders who had stumbled into something far older and more dangerous than any of us had imagined. The father had reached the point where the lake bottom dropped away sharply, and he was now swimming toward where the children's voices seemed strongest. But as he moved deeper into the lake, the voices began moving away from him, staying just out of reach. It was clear that whatever had the children was leading him deeper, drawing him away from shore and safety. That's when the other sound started. From all around the lake's perimeter came new voices, not the children this time, but adults speaking in low, urgent tones. These voices were coming from the forest, from the shoreline, from positions that encircled our entire group. As I listened, I realized that some of these voices sounded familiar, speaking with accents and inflections that reminded me of people I knew from my hometown. But that was impossible. We were hours away from any settlement, days away from anyone who might know us personally. Yet the voices continued, calling out names I recognized, using phrases and references that were specific to my life, my relationships, my personal history. One voice, coming from the forest behind our original campsite, was calling my name in a tone that sounded exactly like my ex-husband, the man I'd divorced 2 years ago and hadn't spoken to since. He was calling me to come to him, telling me he'd been looking for me, that he had something important to say. The voice was perfect, down to the slight lisp he had when he was emotional, but I knew it couldn't be him. It couldn't be any of them. Dawn came slowly to the lake, creeping across the water like oil spreading over glass. By the time the first pale light began filtering through the forest canopy, the voices had fallen silent, the shapes in the water had disappeared, and the lake had returned to its deceptive tranquility. But the damage had been done, and nothing would ever be the same for any of us who survived that night. The father had been found floating face down near the center of the lake, his body showing no signs of violence or struggle. He appeared to have simply stopped swimming, stopped fighting, and allowed himself to sink beneath the surface. When the authorities arrived later that morning, summoned by an emergency beacon one of the other campers had activated, they would list the cause of death as accidental drowning, possibly due to hypothermia and disorientation. Mayura and Eric were never found. The official search lasted 5 days, involving divers, sonar equipment, and teams of volunteers who combed every inch of the lake and surrounding forest. They found no trace of the children, no bodies, no clothing, no evidence that they had ever been at the lake at all. The only proof of their existence was their mother's testimony and the family photos on her phone, images that seemed to grow fainter each time she looked at them. The other campers corroborated parts of our story: the torn tent, the parents' obvious distress, the father's desperate swim into the dark water. But none of them remembered hearing the children's screams. None of them had seen the shapes moving in the lake, and none of them could explain why their own sleep had been so deep and undisturbed while chaos erupted around them. Astrid and I gave our statements to the police, describing what we had witnessed as accurately as we could. But even as we spoke, I could see the skepticism in the officers' eyes, the way they exchanged glances when they thought we weren't looking. Our story sounded like the result of stress, sleep deprivation, and the kind of group hysteria that sometimes affects people in isolated situations. The mother left with the search and rescue team on the 3rd day, her face hollow with grief and shock. She looked at Astrid and me before getting into the helicopter. her eyes holding questions she couldn't voice and accusations she couldn't prove. We had been there when her children vanished. We had witnessed their disappearance, and yet we had done nothing to save them. The lake was closed to camping indefinitely, though no official reason was given. A small sign was posted at the trailhead, citing environmental concerns and ongoing research. But those of us who had been there knew the real reason. Something lived in those dark waters. Something that had claimed the lake as its own territory and would not tolerate intruders. I returned home to my small town, to my quiet life, to the familiar routines that had once brought me comfort. But sleep became my enemy, filled with dreams of dark water and voices calling from impossible depths. During the day, I found myself avoiding any body of water larger than a bathtub, crossing bridges with my eyes fixed straight ahead, unable to look down at the rivers flowing beneath. Astrid moved to Stockholm a month later, citing job opportunities and the need for a change of scenery. We spoke once after she left, a brief, awkward conversation that ended with both of us acknowledging that our friendship had become another casualty of that night by the lake. Some experiences are too intense to survive, too terrible to be shared without destroying the people who shared them. The official investigation was closed after 6 months, the case filed under accidental death with missing persons presumed drowned. The lake was eventually reopened to hikers and campers, though it never regained its former popularity. Those who did venture there reported unusually poor fishing, electronic equipment that malfunctioned for no apparent reason, and a general feeling of unease that made extended stays unpleasant. I never returned to Djupsjön, though I drive past the trailhead several times a year on my way to other hiking destinations. Each time I slow down and look toward the forest path that leads to the lake, wondering if the families who occasionally walk that trail with their children and camping gear have any idea what they might encounter in those dark waters. Sometimes, on particularly quiet nights when the wind is still and my small town seems wrapped in unnatural silence, I can still hear them, the voices from the lake, calling across impossible distances to remind me that some places in this world belong to things that are older, stranger, and far more dangerous than we like to believe. The children are still out there, somewhere beneath the surface of that black water, and they're no longer alone. God help anyone who goes looking for them.